William Lutz, what is doublespeak?
Doublespeak is language designed to evade responsibility, make the unpleasant appear pleasant, the unattractive appear attractive. Basically, it's language that pretends to communicate but really doesn't. It is language designed to mislead while pretending not to.
Is it done consciously?
Oh, yes, very consciously. Doublespeak is not a slip of the tongue or a mistaken use of language. It's exactly the opposite. It is language used by people who are very intelligent and very sophisticated in the use of language and know that you can do an awful lot with language.
Who's the worst offender?
In sheer bulk,
Yes.
sheer numbers of examples, the government. If we count government from the local level all the way up to the federal level, I had to stop writing the chapter on government doublespeak. It was going to take over the whole book. But interestingly enough, and this was a revelation in doing the book, about a half a step behind comes business with a tremendous amount of doublespeak.
How long has the government been using doublespeak?
I think of government as the third oldest profession, and probably from the moment government was instituted, doublespeak came with it. I cite examples from the 5th century BC in Greece, Julius Caesar, when he pacified Gaul. Of course, Nazi Germany thrived on doublespeak. So it's been around for quite a while.
When did you first get interested in this?
In 1978, I became head of the Committee on Public Doublespeak. And in 1980, I started editing the Quarterly Review of Doublespeak. And that's when I became very interested in it, simply because as editing, I have all the examples of doublespeak sent to me. And so I wade through them all.
What got you interested in it?
My interest in rhetoric. I did, in my PhD, I did work in rhetoric. And I was interested in rhetoric. And in 1977, I published a textbook called The Age of Communication, which was a little different at the time. I tried to examine the rhetoric of television, radio, the mass media, advertising, taking Aristotle's classical rhetoric and apply it to modern media. And I had a lot of fun doing that, and as a result of that textbook, I was asked to join the committee, and I saw rhetoric and language coming all together in doublespeak in an interesting way.
Universities also have a problem with doublespeak, don't they?
Oh, yes. Oh, I continually bite the hand that feeds when I cite Rutgers, and at least every issue I have an example from Rutgers University. One of my favorite, we don't have a physical education department at Rutgers. We have a department of human kinetics.
Why?
Well, I also point out in my book that people in physical education have come up with all of these different terms because they've gone professional. They now have their own journals, so they have their own academic jargon. And as the dean at Minnesota, who wanted to change the name of his physical education school, said, we're not taken seriously unless we have a name like this. We can't get the grants. We can't publish the articles.
How long have you been at Rutgers?
Since 1971.
What do you teach?
I teach a variety of courses in the English department, but I teach rhetoric, linguistics, and some Victorian literature. And I also teach a survey course that's required of all students. We start with the Iliad and the Odyssey and work our way up.
Is there any example in history, I mean ancient history in literature, of doublespeak?
Yes, one I cite just as a passing example is Thucydides in the 5th century BC in the Peloponnesian War. During the war there was a very vicious civil war in Athens at that time. And Thucydides points out that at that time the very language itself became corrupted to their own ends. Acts of cowardice became acts of great bravery. Traitorous deeds towards friends became patriotic acts, and he cites the whole list. And it's interesting that Thucydides cites this corruption of language as the ultimate in horror that occurred during that civil war.
Do you ever personally find yourself using doublespeak?
Oh yeah. When I was head of the department, I had to engage in doublespeak. You have to write recommendations, you have to write personnel evaluation forms. I had to pitch for more money, and so you use the doublespeak of bureaucracy as anyone else. If I were a bureaucrat who would function within the bureaucracy using straight language, I wouldn't be taken seriously. It's a sort of ritualistic use of language.
Are you in this whole world of doublespeak because you want to get rid of it?
Oh yes. I don't think you'll ever get rid of it. I don't think we can. It is inherent in the function of language, to use language as a weapon or as a tool to manipulate other people. However, I think there are two things we can do. First of all, we can all become much more aware of this language. We should be aware of it so that we can at least be defensive and defend ourselves so that we're not misled through it. But secondly, there are times when we simply cannot tolerate this language. When we talk about important public issues of national policy, we should not use doublespeak as a nation. We should not use it ourselves. We should not allow the politicians who are speaking to us to use it. Language that way can be terribly corrupting in a society and can mislead all of us. And in a democracy that depends upon the active participation of its citizens, it can lead to cynicism and resentment and a withdrawal from the political process.
What's the most often asked question?
The chapter on food and food doublespeak. Everyone goes after that one about, is it true that you can put sugar-free on a product and still have sugar in it? Is probably the one question I've been asked most often, because people simply can't believe that happens.
How can it happen?
Because sugar-free simply means they haven't added table sugar or cane sugar to it. They can add mannose, fructose, any of the syrup sweeteners and still call it sugar-free.
So you know when you eat something that's sugar-free, there's sugar in it.
Oh, yes, and by the way, I found out in a radio interview when they had people in the audience calling in, a man called in and said, do you mean that there's sugar in there? I said, well, yes, there's sugars in that food. He said, well, I'm a diabetic, and my wife makes sure she buys only the sugar-free. I said, you can't eat those. You have to use only the dietetic, because that's governed by law. Sugar-free isn't. Here's a man who was threatening his health through this kind of false labeling. It was
therapeutic misadventures, the economically non-affluent, and deep-chilled chickens, the doublespeak of everyday life. Everyday living, excuse me. What is a therapeutic misadventure?
I will tell you the incident, and then you can figure it out. In 1982, during a cesarean operation, the anesthetist turned the wrong knob and killed the mother and child. The hospital called this a therapeutic misadventure. 3 weeks ago in Los Angeles, according to the Los Angeles Times, in a series of incidents that the pathologist called incredible stupidity and incompetence, the surgeons killed the patient. It included slitting the patient's throat during surgery. This was called a therapeutic misadventure.
How about economically non-affluent?
That's what the president of the City University of New York called the poor students attending the City University. They came from economically non-affluent families.
Deep-chilled chickens.
Frank Perdue filed a complaint with the Department of Agriculture that his competitors were selling frozen chickens as fresh. And the Department of Agriculture investigated and said, no, granted the chickens are packed in ice at a temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit. These are not frozen chickens. These are merely deep-chilled chickens and can therefore be sold as fresh. I suggested that we pack the same Department of Agriculture bureaucrats in ice. When they hit 28 degrees, we might ask them if they're deep-chilled or frozen. Well, Orwell in his two works, his essay, Politics in the English Language, and then really giving full-blown thought to that essay in his novel 1984, addressed the importance of language in society and the control and manipulation of language to control and direct society. I think the most important point in 1984 is that power grows not out of the barrel of a gun. Power grows not out of the thought police and rule by terror. It grows out of the power of language in that novel. The revolutionary act committed by Winston Smith right at the beginning of that novel is to keep a diary. In keeping a diary, any person who keeps a diary uses language to communicate with the self. You're talking to yourself and you're thinking through words about the world around you and about how you feel. That's why a diary is such a revolutionary act in 1984, because you are reasserting personal control over language. Then at the end of the novel, to parallel that scene, when Winston Smith has been found out and O'Brien, his torturer and guide, says to him, what is reality? Reality is not external. Reality exists not in the mind of the individual, which soon perishes, but in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. What the party says is reality is real. And how else can the party do that? Except by language. Party has taken control of language and has taken it away from the individual. And that's the power, because those in power who control language control the way we see the world.
Let's talk about political parties just for a second. Let me name three for you and tell me which one is the worst abuser of doublespeak. The Communist Party, the Democratic Party, or the Republican Party in history?
I would say I'd give them all three. They're right in there by the nature of politics. I would say that the Communist Party would be leading the other two simply because under the time of Stalin and others, language was used to justify, mass murder. Murder of millions of people, exactly the same as the Nazis did. Use a language to justify murder. But as we see, any politician in power starts using doublespeak. The Democrats did. Right? I love Jimmy Carter's comment on the failed raid to free the hostages in Iran. He called it an incomplete success. He did that without even thinking about it. He was just automatically using that kind of language. But we had used language in Vietnam to justify our actions in Vietnam. The Republican Party, once attaining power, has used doublespeak to justify and explain and silence their critics. But I don't see that as being different from any other politician. What Orwell says in Politics in the English Language is, it is clear that the corruption of language ultimately has political and economic causes. But in 1947, he published Politics in the English Language, an essay which, by the way, is the most reprinted essay in the English language. It's just endlessly reprinted, in which he warned about the corruption of thought through language. The examples he used all came from Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. He had, during the Second World War, served in the British Ministry of Propaganda or Information and was introduced to the inside of the propaganda process. And he wrote 1984 as a novel of the future in which, given the growth of the power of communications and the sophisticated use of language, totalitarian governments would base their power upon the control of minds through language, and that the language was deliberately opaque to give special tax breaks to a lot of people and corporations. That's tens of billions of dollars worth. We think that that's important, that people know about that this language is being used to take money out of their pockets, because somebody's going to have to make up for that missing tax revenue. So we're looking for people who contribute to honesty in language, clarity in language that way.
Okay, the recipients of the Doublespeak Award. Same group give out?
Yes, the same group. We vote each year, and from the nominations that we receive, and we try to give the award as a symbolic award to an American public figure who has used doublespeak that has consequences of some kind on public policy or a public issue. In 1989, we gave it to Exxon Corporation for calling the 35 miles of shoreline in Alaska environmentally clean. When reporters pointed out that there was still oil all over the place, an Exxon spokesman said, well, clean doesn't mean that every oil stain is off every rock. It means the natural inhabitants can live there. As Orwell said, it's political language, and political language tends to, in the 20th century, to be this kind of misleading and deceptive language, whether it's Johnson. By the way, the legacy from the Johnson administration was the language of Vietnam and the language of the poverty program, which stopped calling people poor and started calling them disadvantaged, and stopped talking about slums and ghettos, but the inner city. I mean, that's a heritage of doublespeak from the Johnson administration.
Let me go back to when we started this conversation. I asked you, I think in the beginning, is this done on purpose and with calculation? And you said yes.
Yes. In fact, I cite a couple incidents in the book where I can document it was done. One is revenue enhancement. They had a meeting in the Office of Management and Budget. They said, we need a phrase to replace tax increase. They came up with revenue enhancement. When Lawrence Kudlow, the economist, was asked why they did that, he said, because there's no better way to sell economic policy than the euphemistic route. He was quite proud of the fact that they came up with that phrase. And Peacekeeper, as the name for the MX missile, again, Robert McFarland chaired the committee meeting in which he facetiously suggested that they couldn't name it Widowmaker, could they? So instead they came up with Peacemaker. But later, President Reagan misread his cue cards and said Peacekeeper. And since it was a televised speech, it became the Peacekeeper. And it was a name that was deliberately designed to make a nuclear missile sound nice.
Does it work?
Yes? Oh, of course it
I
works.
mean, most people don't hear it.
They will hear some of it, but not all of it. One of my favorite examples from this past year is the Resource Development Park that they were going to establish in Kansas City, until the good folks in the neighborhood where they were going to put the park asked, what is a Resource Development Park? Do you know what a Resource Development Park is? In Kansas City, it's a dump. They were going to put a dump in their neighborhood until somebody asked what it meant. They deliberately invented that phrase to try and slip a dump into the neighborhood without anyone noticing it until it was too late.
We have just have one last question. Your favorite doublespeak word or phrase?
The Department of Defense, which until 1947 was the Department of War.
The book is called Doublespeak, and it's written by William Lutz, published by Harper & Row, in your bookstores. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.